If you're like me and you're a fan of the Premier League, or really any other top league in the world right now, you'll recognize what's happening here. This is a VAR check, and if the mention of those three letters in that combination is giving you the urge to burn something down, you should know that you're definitely not alone. And we're going to get into why in a minute, but before we really get going here, I want to take a second to mention the sponsor of today's video. This episode of Student of the Game is brought to you by Aura. Have you ever typed your name into Google and found it incredibly easy to find your personal information? Well, like a club trying to get around financial fair play rules, data brokers sell that information to scammers, spammers, and anyone else who may want to target you. Your full name, email, home address, health records, your relatives, it's all out there. That's why I've been using Aura, the sponsor of today's video. Aura shows me which data brokers are selling my information and automatically submits opt-out requests for me, because I don't want any of those people selling my information. Cleaning up my personal data not only helps reduce the amount of spam I get, which is good because I don't like that at all, but it also protects me from hackers who could use that to help them access my social media accounts, bank accounts, or other sensitive areas that I'd prefer to keep to myself. Aura also does so much more to protect me and my family from online threats that I can't see, like a left tackle protecting my blind side. It's really easy to set up, so I don't have to download several different apps to get things like antivirus, VPN, password management, parental controls, identity theft insurance, and more. I get everything at one affordable price. You may already have one or two of these tools, but not having Aura is like locking the front door and leaving the back door wide open. Aura is always on, doing the hard work of keeping me safe so I can focus on other tasks with peace of mind, like making new Student of the Game videos. Privacy and protection are important to everyone. You can go to aura.com/game to start your 2-week free trial. Okay, back to how referees are ruining everything. Unfortunately, few game weeks this season have gone by without some enormous officiating controversy grabbing all the headlines. There have been games decided by goals that should have been chopped off. There have been goals disallowed that never should have been. And, of course, there have been dozens of penalty and booking decisions that have left everyone confused about how the rules are being applied, or even what the rules are in the first place. This has led to a prevailing belief among fans that officiating has never been worse, and that idea is not restricted to world football. In a poll of 68 NFL players done by The Athletic in 2023, a quarter of them said that the officials were the biggest problem with the league right now, and over half rated them as either a 5 out of 10 or below. Data from the NBA showed similar results, and in baseball, polls continue to show that fans are growing more and more supportive of eliminating as much of the human element of officiating as possible. But it's in the Premier League, where a poll by The Independent showed that 2/3 of fans oppose the way the game is currently officiated, especially as it pertains to VAR, where this effect is most pronounced. All of this has led me to the conclusion that it's time to do a full analysis of the current state of refereeing, not just of how well they're doing their jobs, but also of what those jobs should actually be, and whether or not we can get to a point where things are better. But before we can really talk about VAR checks or robo-umps or anything along those lines, we've got to get a lot more granular than that and talk about the philosophy of refereeing itself. And who better to do that than a philosophy professor, which is exactly what Dr. Seth Bordner is. In 2019, Dr. Bordner wrote a paper entitled "Why You Don't Have to Choose Between Accuracy and Human Officiating," which is obviously pretty relevant to the discussion we're having here, but that wasn't the only thing I noticed from going through it.
I read through most of your paper and then circled back to I think I might want to reach out to this guy, and the amount of joy that I experienced seeing that you work at the University of Alabama it was significant. That kind of made my day, honestly.
It was great.
I wanted to ask, because I know you're a philosophy professor, and that encompasses a lot of different things, but the philosophy of sport.
Yeah.
That's not something that you hear very often. I don't think that's going to be something that my audience is going to be super familiar with. So what does that mean to you, first and foremost?
Right. So philosophy of sport, like any other philosophy of anything, is first and foremost an attempt to try to understand the thing that it's studying. Right. So philosophy of sport tries to understand what sports are and what the nature of sport is, just like philosophy of medicine tries to understand medicine, or philosophy of science tries to understand science. And the difference there is, you might think, well, if you want to understand what sports are, wouldn't you just go play sports or get involved in them? And there's a difference there between people who, I hope you appreciate, between people who do the job, right? Who may or may not find it useful to think about why they're doing this thing, because they're busy doing it.
In Dr. Bordner's mind, there is an important difference between the people analyzing the sport and the people performing it. kind of like the difference between the offensive coordinator and the quarterback. There can be a lot of crossover between those two jobs, so much so that many quarterbacks end up becoming offensive coordinators later on, but they have fundamentally different goals. Coaches have to be able to ask why things are happening, and then try to come up with answers, similarly to a philosophy professor, or even a referee. A referee has to understand the nature of the game they're officiating, ideally better than anyone else, but even if that's true, that understanding and its application will still be imperfect, which is how we wind up with all these perceived mistakes. And regardless of how good a job you think the refs are doing, that discrepancy is enough to drive a logician like Dr. Bordner absolutely nuts.
My view has always been, we're interested in these facts, we're interested in these games, and we want these games to be determined by the performance of the players themselves. And yet, we're letting these really inefficient and ineffective human beings be the arbiters of what these exceptionally fine-grained efforts, right? Whether they're successful or not. And I thought, we know we can do better. The way we know that we can do better is that we already are doing better. In fact, we're using technology to evaluate the umpires. That strikes me as being a really inefficient system. If we insist upon using human beings, what kind of criteria would we need to use in order for human beings to judge it as well as machines currently can judge the criteria that we currently use? And the answer is pretty ugly ones. You know, we'd have to go to something pretty basic, pretty Flintstone level technologically in order for us to be able to track those criteria reliably with human eyes.
That assessment of human inefficiency presents us with a couple of pretty extreme options, neither of which is going to sound super appealing. We can either strip the games down to that prehistoric level where all the nuance or subjectivity is essentially eliminated, or we can go the other way and play sports at what Dr. Bordner describes as the quantum level, where everything is technically accurate, but so much so that we don't even recognize the game anymore. Either way, we're losing the essence of something a whole lot of people care a whole lot about, all for the sake of eliminating ambiguity. And this kind of thing has happened before, just in a wildly different context than anything we've ever looked at on this channel. It's time to talk about Pluto? In 2005, a team of astronomers discovered Eris, an astronomical object located about 9 billion miles from Earth. And that was pretty significant because, by the definitions at the time, Eris was probably the 10th planet in our solar system. It was gravitationally rounded, bigger than Pluto, and it orbited around the sun. But that also created a serious problem in the scientific community.
What resulted was a bit of a crisis, astronomically speaking, because no one knew what to call it. It was bigger than Pluto, at least in terms of mass. It's about the same size as Pluto. And so it seemed to be a planet if Pluto's a planet. And yet, because it proved that Pluto wasn't unique, and as it turns out, Pluto and Eris are likewise just two of a whole range of objects of similar size in the solar system, it put pressure on the notion of a planet as being something special. And so the astronomers had to kind of make a choice. Do we want to devalue, right, this concept of a planet such that it applies to so many things that the concept is no longer special? Or do we want to be clearer about what we mean by a planet so that we can make it clear that these things are special in an astronomical sense?
Now, at this point, you may still be wondering what this has to do with the video about refereeing, and I promise we're going to get there, but NASA knew that if they defined Eris as a planet, they would be setting a precedent whereby they would have to also make any other body that had those same characteristics a planet too. But here's the thing. This was only a problem because astronomers now had the technology and data to make it one.
The problem wasn't they didn't know enough about Eris, or they didn't know enough about Pluto, or they couldn't see well enough with their telescopes. The problem wasn't that they lacked the information. The problem was they just didn't know what to do with the concept, how to apply, how to classify that information.
NASA's solution wasn't to wait until they could gather better data. They already had the data they needed. What they needed was a better way to describe and classify that data. And so, to solve their big philosophical problem, they demoted Pluto. Eris and Pluto, among a few others, are considered dwarf planets because they don't exhibit the same level of dynamical dominance, or clearing the neighborhood, that the actual planets in our solar system do. It may have come at the cost of having 9 of them, but astronomers now have a better and clearer way of classifying what's considered a planet and what isn't, which I imagine makes their job much simpler and easier to communicate to their contemporaries. And that is where we bring it all back to refereeing. We're seeing the game in a way that it has never been seen before, but we don't know what to do with that. I would argue that the biggest issue with refereeing today is not the technology or the referees themselves, but the concepts that they're trying to interpret. Take, for instance, the handball rule. IFAB, which is the International Football Association Board, has a pretty comprehensive definition for a rule that I think we all understand the spirit of. And yet, there are a couple of words in here that are not straightforward at all. Making your body unnaturally bigger? What does that mean? There's language in here talking about intent and how appropriate certain actions are for a given situation. And those things are inherently subjective. In American football, we have rules against things like intentional grounding, where we're measuring something that's actually being thrown into the air and doesn't have to be intentional at all to be called a penalty. There was a whole controversy a few years ago about the definition of a catch, where we all got way too familiar with the phrase surviving the ground, which still doesn't make any sense. The technology to track what's going on is getting better, yes, but perhaps as a result, our way of classifying it seems to be getting more complicated. And as Dr. Bordner pointed out to me, that is a problem.
We can all see what happened, but we don't know how to classify it. What counts as a football move? What's a terrible concept? A football move? There are lots of moves that are made in football. It's not as if something is being hidden here. It's not as if we're missing part of the action. We just don't know how to classify it.
As Dr. Bordner noted in his paper, modern officiating is experiencing the same crisis that NASA was when Eris was discovered. We have all this incredible technology that can capture almost exactly what's happening in our favorite sports. But what are we doing with what it's telling us? In March 2023, William Ralston wrote an article in The Guardian entitled "The Impossible Job: Inside the World of Premier League Referees." I will go ahead and warn you that it's about 9,000 words long, but if you've got a spare hour or so, I would highly recommend reading it because there is some absolutely fascinating stuff in there. Because if you're trying to better understand the level of human error and subjectivity that goes into all of this, there's not much better place to start than with the human subjects themselves. According to Ralston's article, top referees make around 300 decisions per game over the course of 90 minutes. Some of those decisions will be pretty straightforward, like whether a ball went across the goal line or went out of play. But far more of them, like 80+%, will require some degree of interpretation on the fly, like whether 2 players coming together was worthy of calling a foul or not, or if a ball touched somebody's hand. That is a lot of cognitive load to put on someone, but especially so in the context of a profession that continues to get more and more physically demanding. A review from Germany in 2020 identified 13 papers that correlated physical load with a decrease in decision-making accuracy, particularly as referees got deeper into matches or their running speed had increased. So with that in mind, it would make sense to get these people some help, right? If only there was a system in place that was designed to help them see the things they couldn't. But like finding a celestial body that's the same size as Pluto, the introduction of that system has opened an entirely different can of worms. First, there's the cognitive effect that comes from a referee knowing that the system is there in the first place. If you know that there's a chance for your decision to be reviewed, that can impact the stakes of getting every decision right, even if it's just subconscious. Referees are already prone to impacts from home crowds, or social bias, as well as omission bias, which is commonly referred to as swallowing the whistle in important situations. Throw in the notion that your decision might get reviewed and end up not meaning anything at all, and we're already 3 degrees removed from a referee being able to do their job instinctively. But then there are the issues with VAR itself. No one is sure of exactly what this process is actually supposed to do, including, it turns out, the referees. In his piece, Ralston describes a moment where a group of 49 refs are attending a bi-weekly meeting at England's National Football Centre. At this meeting, the group is given a number of clips to vote on beforehand over whether or not they would intervene as the VAR. Put another way, these men and women have to decide if the call on the field was clear and obvious enough to need correcting. And in one case, the room was split almost directly down the middle. These are the most qualified people in the world to do this job. They trained for years to be in this position, and yet, when it really comes down to it, they can be as uncertain as the rest of us as to how all this is supposed to work. There's another quote from earlier in that same article that genuinely shook me. UEFA's chief refereeing officer is a guy called Roberto Rossetti. He was in charge of VAR being implemented for the first time at the 2018 World Cup. So if you're going to get an authority on how refereeing is supposed to be done and how VAR fits into it, this is probably the guy to ask. And yet, Ralston writes, when Rossetti experimented with using VAR to review every incident in a single match, he found 7 penalties and 3 red cards, according to a strict reading of the laws of the game. And this is what he thought of that experience. You can see the logic there, but taken another way, Rossetti is essentially saying that we can either enforce the rules the way they're written or play the game, but not both. If you want to point to a reason that there's a problem with officiating right now, there it is. That's not a dispute over whether a guy was offsides or not. That's a crisis on the level of NASA not knowing what a planet is. The driving force behind VAR and all the other technology like it in other sports was the idea that those sports not only could be, but should be more objective. But whether we like it or not, that's got to stop somewhere. I really like the way that Darren England, the referee that Ralston worked with for his piece, pointed out how many people mistake refereeing for an objective science. As England himself pointed out, different referees will judge things differently, and in a few cases, there may be no such thing as a correct decision.
At the quantum level, at the subatomic level, there are really serious questions about whether there is an objective reality that exists independently of its being observed or measured. Yeah, I completely get that. We don't play football at the quantum level, okay? There are absolutely problems of deciding whether the ball was in or out, whether there was any part of the body that was beyond the last defender. There are very, very much difficulties in deciding that. Sometimes the difficulty is literally we don't have enough information. We couldn't see closely enough. We couldn't, if you will, draw lines finely enough to be able to decide with any high degree of confidence whether or not the case matches up with our criteria. But the other way in which we make a big mistake is that we fail to specify criteria in ways that we are able to determine, right? There are going to be a whole range of cases where it's not clear. And zooming in isn't going to help you.
I agree that the state of refereeing is kind of rough right now, but not because we don't have the right people doing the job. It's tempting to think that swapping out all the refs for new ones would be enough to solve the problem, but let me tell you, here in the States, we had that kind of experiment forced upon us a while back when the refs went on strike, and it did not go well. The main problem, I think, is this. In his contribution to William Ralston's article, Dr. Bordner wrote that largely because of technologies like VAR, there's a tendency to think of games as perfectible, but unless we radically change the rules, they're not. Data from the Premier League shows that not only are referees actually getting more accurate year over year, but aside from around 5 decisions per match, referees are already doing a pretty excellent job of interpreting and enforcing the rules. Unfortunately though, as we've already established, those 5 mistakes tend to happen in the game's most crucial and demanding moments. VAR was supposed to help make up that gap, but it was never designed to be an objective measure like Hawkeye or semi-automated offsides. We've had review like this in the States for 25 years now, and have had the time to get used to what it can and can't do. But Europe isn't there yet, and the growing pains are frustrating people to the point that a lot of them are ready to just give up on it altogether. But I wouldn't just yet, especially since there are some concrete steps that football could take towards making officiating both simpler and more intuitive. The first would be to have referees who specialize in VAR officiating to be the ones who do that job. If I learned anything from that Ralston article, is that being a good field referee is just as much about fitness and player management as it is about knowing the rules. Those skills aren't as much use in a sterile VAR room that's miles from the actual game, so getting people who've trained specifically in that job is a good start. But more importantly, the concepts that these people are refereeing need to be more clearly defined. What kind of call should be eligible for a VAR check? What constitutes a clear and obvious error? I know it's already been a few years since VAR was first introduced, but it's going to take even more time to get enough data to figure those things out more definitively. And until then, it's probably going to be a pretty bumpy ride. But the fact that everyone in every sport is complaining about the refs right now makes me think that things aren't actually that bad. Refereeing is broken because our concept of it is broken, and until that gets fixed, things will always seem like they're getting worse and worse. But are they actually? Well, that's up to your interpretation. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for taking a few minutes out of what I'm sure is a very busy schedule to spend some time with us. I'm Will, and this is my channel, Student of the Game, where we look at topics that relate to sports psychology and culture. This is one of the most ambitious and far-reaching projects I've worked on since I started this channel, and I don't just mean in the sense that we literally talked about Pluto for like 2 full minutes. Refereeing is something that affects absolutely everyone, but still seems to get misunderstood pretty easily, and I wanted to give that all the time it deserved to unpack. Let me know what you think of the state of officiating in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stuff like it. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with another very nerd-friendly video, but until then, I'm Will, and this is Student of the Game. See you next time.